Welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick one on the TINHIFI T5S, which is also known as Mars. So they've done a couple space theme sets before, and I never really understood the connection, but we will go with it. So the T5S is actually a classy looking set, right? All metal build. It's got a nice faceplate that has some little texture to it, which you can see under the right lighting conditions. But yeah, I would call it kind of a nice, classy looking, nice shape. It actually is comfortable and it feels well in the hand. You know, I think all around, I think that one is pretty much what a $130 shell should look like. And at least they went back to 2-pin as opposed to MMCX like on the T2 Mark II. So all that was pretty good. I think the cable is actually quite nice. It's a softer mix of SPC, and I think that's just dark copper. So it has maybe a black and silver look to it, but I think it's really just a dark copper, maybe a tinted insulated on the copper, and a SPC braided together. But it's actually kind of nice because it's soft. It feels a little softer in hand than it does just looking at it like that. You do get a leather, or maybe this is leatherette case. I'm not sure which one, but yeah, again, pretty cool. Kind of a nice accessory to get with your set. And again, these are $130 sets, so you're kind of expecting some kind of nice accessories with it. And I think the cable and the case are pretty much right up there, along with the build quality that you get on the actual shell. So all that is kind of jives with $130. So what is actually special here, and I would just say it's a nice driver. They called it an ultra linear driver. They don't really go into heavy detail on what the driver is, but you can tell it's actually a quite nice driver. They did quite nice tuning, kind of a likable, slightly warm sound with an edge to it. And I think the edge to it is sort of where I would differentiate this set from a lot of other one dynamic drivers. Some, especially the cheaper ones, tend to be a little softer, and this one has kind of a nice defined edge to it, which makes it sound not like every other one dynamic driver. And I thought that was actually pretty cool. Whether you're willing to spend the $130 just to have that, I think that's a bigger question. But I do have a couple of nitpicks with it, and we'll start right there. I think the $130 price, it's really up there. I think when you go above $100, I tend to say the same thing. It's just up there for a single one dynamic driver. It really needs to stand out, do something super, super well. And this one, I think it's a nice driver and it's got nice tuning. But as far as a standout, as far as coming after Simcoe's EA 500LM, I think this one is going to struggle a bit at that price point. And that edge to the sound, it can sound a little bit sharp and even a little bit nasally if you have a very flat source. I think it does pick up a little bit of a nasal sound to it. Folks who really find one dynamic drivers too soft will really appreciate the edge that TINHIFI put into it. It's somewhere in between maybe a C3 and a C2. It's not as sharp as C2, but there's definitely a little bit of an edge to it. And maybe to me, it sounded a little sharper, a little bit more digital than organic. But if you change the tips and you do a little source rolling with a warmer source, it tends to go away or be a lot less noticeable. But the air level, I think the upper treble level, I think is kind of a nitpick because they rolled it off a little bit, or it's going to be a bonus. And let's kind of take a look at what's going on the graph quickly. So here's what it looks like on the graph. And so I put it against C3, and I think they are very similar tunings. And I didn't go back and measure my C3, but I would assume that they're going to be actually quite close, and probably closer than they appear here, because I'm not sure that that T5S really dips like that. It probably does hug the Harman curve like it does in C3. This 10K is sort of a fingerprint of my coupler. There's probably a 10K peak right down here, but mine tends to resonate it up to at a much higher level. It's one of those things that if you look at enough of my measurements, you'll see that 10K is usually in the wrong spot, and it's usually higher than what it should be. But then I said this upper treble kind of rolls off a little quicker than even C3 does, and it gives you a different style of sound. It's kind of like there's a slight edge to it. There's a slight quietness to the upper treble. It's not dark. It's just they kind of quieted out a lot of the upper treble. So it's kind of like C3, but not quite like C3. It's definitely done on a nicer driver. So But level-wise, it's not all that far from what they did with C3. It's probably a tuning that they happen to like. So as I was talking about, the way the treble extends and rolls down is kind of interesting to listen to. It sounds extended, but it's really quiet at both ends. I think the driver is fast enough. It is a really nice driver, and the levels are good enough in the bass to really give you that black background even through the bass. There's not a lot of persistent mid-bass hanging around clouding up the stage. There's a nice kind of airiness to it, and it kind of sees right through it. You can hear right through it, but you get the same effect in the upper treble, kind of where you're expecting to hear upper treble and air and those things kind of hit your ear in a certain place. It doesn't quite do that because they rolled it off. So you end up with this kind of nice quietness in the upper end. If you've ever been into a room with a sound deadening material on the walls, it kind of sounds like that. There's just a quietness at both ends to it, and it's kind of interesting to me. I don't know if people are going to like that or not like that. It's just something different that you don't hear on every other set. If you're used to hearing the upper treble kind of tickle your ear in certain places, you're not going to get that on this one. And if you're really used to stage projection, kind of the same thing, it's going to sound a little bit different. But sound, again, I think it's like C3. It's got this boosted bass, but there's more sub-bass focus to it, so it stays cleaner. You've got the Harman upper mid, so that gives you enough energy. And then an early roll-off on the treble, which sounds a little bit different. But it's just not all that far from lots of other sets that... but it's done on a really nice driver. And I don't hate the price just because the driver is actually pretty good. And you get some nice balance even with some volume, which was actually done pretty well here. But bass, again, like I keep on talking about the driver, it's actually a pretty nice driver. Again, at $130, it should be a very, very nice driver. And it kind of comes off as cleaner than most. I think, imagine a nice dynamic driver with the bass shelf that they're showing here. And that's exactly what it sounds like. So they pushed off some energy into the sub bass, so that doesn't necessarily cloud or muddle anything. They just put a bunch of energy out there. But as you kind of walk into the mids, and when you follow the red line in, you can kind of see as they get closer to the mids, this is dropping below. This is about 5 dB here. By the time you're at 200, you're probably, at 2 or 3. By the time you're in at 300, maybe you're at 1 or 2. So they actually do arc this in, so there's not a whole lot of mid-bass energy carrying in through the mids, just enough to warm it up to give it a little smoother sound, and I think they did that quite well, but it's not like a heavy, boomy mid-bass set at all. I think they actually got this curve pretty well, and the driver handles that kind of curve well at the same time. So, yeah, I think they got the bass actually quite nice. It's not the best, not the worst, but it's definitely kind of right up there with a nice style tuning that really keeps the mids clean and it gives you a nice fun sound. I think this one definitely probably likes a little bit more power to keep it a little bit tighter. It's just not a hard hitter as it probably could be if they had actually done a mid-bass bump out. Like, I think the driver can probably hit pretty hard. They tended to do a conservative mid-bass bump on it, so it's kind of hard to hear it. But yeah, there's probably a nice impact hitter hiding somewhere in the driver. I think that would have been a little bit more fun. But the mids, and again, I think this is another volume rolling set where you really have to have enough volume so it sounds a little bit more dynamic. If there's not enough volume, it tends to sound less dynamic, a little bit recessed. It kind of pulls back. If you turn it up until you hear the dynamics of female vocals, like a Madonna, that's kind of where the zone you need to be in. It's not, I wouldn't really call it a lower volume set at all. I think you really need to hear the balance fall in place on this one, and that takes just a little bit of volume. So, yeah, maybe not your typical tin where this one needs a little bit more volume, and it tends to be a little bit more recessed at lower volumes. I think they tend to ride the brighter line, and even though it looks like the upper mids kind of hug the Harman line, I'm not actually sure that mine is really dipped. Maybe it is dipped, and maybe that's why I'm saying it takes a little bit more energy for the female vocals to fall in place. But there's something to it where at lower volume it tends to fall back a little bit faster. Maybe it's the driver, maybe it's the bass tuning. There is something to the tuning where I definitely noticed it, that you definitely have to play with the volume and make sure that you are in the right zone, and it becomes a fun set. And I'll admit it, it's a fun set, and it sounds very clean. There's really decent resolution, but it doesn't stand out enough to warrant the price, and that's ultimately what's going to go on with this one. Is the $130 after EA5LM, after other sets which came out which were nice and cheaper, I think it's going to be a very, very hard sell, and it's very hard to kind of point my finger at something that this set does, other than being, hey, it's got a cool driver and a nice fun tuning. It's a pretty solid tuning. I think TINHIFI has used it before. I think they did it on a newer driver, and it sounds just as good as it did on the older drivers. It sounds a little bit better, but I'm not sure how many people are going to willing to pay $130 just to hear that. And the treble, again, this is kind of where the price starts to bother me a bit. Other than needing a bit more volume, the upper mids and the lower treble, it's handled like lots of other sets, right? They kind of hug this line. You've kind of heard what that sounds like. Sounds very familiar. And then when they dip off the upper treble, that's kind of where I said that, there's just not enough being added to the top to give you a little more resolution, a little bit more sparkle, a little bit more dynamics in the mids. It was just an odd choice, and I could hear how quiet it is in the upper treble, and that's appealing to some people. But when you kind of go back to what am I really paying for and where does it stand out, I think this was an odd choice to me, and it sounds better as a lower price set than it does at a higher price set. But you do get all the benefits of a more natural sound and a dynamic driver. And this one does have kind of more of a sharper edge to it. There's a speed to it that isn't all that common. Again, the driver is actually quite nice. The upper is where it really sounded like the price and would have made the mid stand out. And yeah, so it just has an extended flat sound. So it sounds like it's not dark. It goes out through extension, but where you're looking for air and some sparkle and some, things and kind of tickling your ear, it doesn't quite get there. So it's certainly not unique to T5S. Other sets have actually done similar roll-offs in the treble, and some people will prefer the quiet, but again, it kind of sounds a little less dynamic in that way. And the stage kind of follows on exactly the same thing. The size of the stage is okay, and it doesn't have much projection, but it has some depth to it, and if you play with the volume, you can kind of get it to sound a little bit bigger or smaller. But the upper treble would have made it sound a little bit more consistently bigger, but the balance gives you, kind of a decent amount of space. They didn't overload the treble and make it really flat. I think play with the volume to get everything in balance, and you actually do get a really nice space there, but it doesn't really extend out or project like with more upper treble would have done on kind of a same driver or similar tuning. Just a little bit more air would have made the sound a little bit more expensive and bigger, and maybe closer to the price point that they picked. So that is what I got on T5S. So again, thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.